A quick note before we begin. This episode is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at theauthorInsideYou.com/freebook. Choose from over 180,000 titles. Go to theauthorInsideYou.com/freebook.
You're listening to the Author Inside You podcast, a weekly podcast designed to motivate you to finish writing a book, choose a publisher, and build an audience. Keep listening if you're looking to get propelled into the next chapter of your life. And now, it's the Author Inside You podcast.
Hello, I'm Matt Rafferty.
And I'm Leah Rafferty.
Joining us today is Chad Elliot, author of Improv Manifesto, 7 Easy Steps to Confidence, Creativity, and Charisma, even if you're shy. Chad has helped hundreds of individuals learn storytelling, public speaking, and other valuable skills through simple improv-style games. Welcome, Chad. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Well, Chad, can you tell us a little bit about your book?
It's basically divided into 7 chapters that each focus on some element of how to communicate and think on your feet. So things like, okay, how do you eliminate writer's block or mental blocks? How do you, generate ideas? How do you communicate to groups? That kind of thing.
Great. And so is your audience writers or is it all types of people?
It's all types of people. It tends to be people who are more introverted or shy or, don't feel particularly creative, but want to be able to communicate better, want to be able to feel confident doing the things they need to do to be successful.
So did the book come out of your business or?
Yeah. So I started a company called Seattle Improv Classes, and I started teaching these 8-week series classes. And at first, I created a booklet to complement the classes, and I put together some articles I had done. And then at a certain point, I got curious about publishing and self-publishing and how that worked, and I wanted to try it. And so I took the booklet I had and I enlarged it, published it through Amazon. As a learning experience, and also it's nice because when I'd hand an actual book to students, there's a credibility that comes with that is stronger than a booklet. It makes them look at you different. They ask for autographs and stuff too. It's kind of fun.
Right. Besides selling the book to your students, how are you marketing it to find other people to buy it?
It's interesting. So, like I said, I viewed it very much as a learning process. I put it on, Amazon, and largely left it to itself, to see what it would do. I got some reviews for it, just by promoting it to students and that sort of thing. But largely, I just let it go, and it has, for fairly little work, it's given me a good return just by putting it on Amazon. And what I was really doing is, since as I published it a few years ago, and I just looked at, okay, was that worth it? Yes, it was. What would I do better? Because there were plenty of mistakes I've made along the way. And so then I started writing a new book, something that I would really want to put lots of effort into, and then I can promote it a whole bunch. And I was in the meanwhile, just kind of learning what is the process of becoming a guest on podcasts to promote a book, or what is the process of getting published, articles published in different places where you can, mention your book, that kind of thing. So I viewed this first book as really a learning process, so that with the next book, which I've been working on for quite some time, that I can really know what I'm doing and have experience to be really successful with that.
Well, congratulations first off on just putting it out there and people found your book, because that in itself is amazing. And also congratulations on being a lifelong learner. I think that's pretty cool that you're constantly trying to learn new things.
Thanks. Yeah, and what I would say is even with that sort of, neophyte stage of putting out the book, a few things that I think are important is you do want to look at, okay, how, even if I'm just putting it on Amazon and getting it out there, what are people searching for? What would appeal to them? So I definitely put thought into the title and the keywords in the title, and what segment of Amazon I put it into. And actually, one little trick I discovered that could be useful to people is if you update the manuscript, if you kind of re-upload a slightly edited version of the manuscript to Amazon, it tends to increase where they put you in the rankings if someone searches for a keyword in your title. So it's just something handy to know.
Yeah, that's cool. So even with just a minor change.
Yeah, I guess they just like, oh, like this person keeps their book updated, so we're going to put them higher in the rankings.
So like us, it seems like you would like to motivate writers. And you have some points, I think, that you could help our listeners. And first one, let's talk about what causes writer's block.
A lot of people tend to put so much pressure on themselves to do a good job that it cripples them, really. Actually, I had a really good friend who wants to be an author, but she would put it off and just find any way not to do it, do any writing. And so, she's very much a perfectionist, like a type A. And so I was like, well, I'll tell you what you can do, though you're not going to like it. And she was like, well, all right, what is it? And I said, well, what I want you to do is I want you to, for 10 minutes every day in the next week, I want you to write for 10 minutes. And then at the end, I want you to delete everything you wrote.
Wow.
And she was like, I hate that idea. But she did it, and she was able to do it because she didn't have to worry that anyone would read it afterwards, that anyone would criticize it, even including herself. Mm-hmm. And she started to notice that she was actually enjoying the writing process because it was taking the criticism out of it. She could just do it. She even called me sort of in tears one day. She was like, oh, I never, I'm actually enjoying this for the first time in years.
Wow, wonderful.
And then after that, she was able to start doing it and not deleting it. But she had you kind of had to short circuit that critique mechanism in her brain. And that's something, there are lots of ways to do that, but that's one kind of fun, bizarre way.
Right.
There's a sort of researcher who studied the creative process that they use at Disney. And one of the things he found is that they had sort of a multi-step process. So at first it was the brainstorming phase. So for when they made Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, they brainstormed 50 names for the Seven Dwarves. They didn't try and come up with the perfect 7 at first, because in that brainstorming stage, it was just okay, come up with as many ideas as you can. And then in a later stage, we'll look at more at okay, what are the practicalities? And from a critical point of view, which of these is good, which of these is bad? But what most people do is they try and come up with ideas at the same time they're criticizing them. And so they think of an idea, they criticize it and shut it away. And then they've just kind of crumple in and just nothing can get out. And so you have to separate those phases. You have to go, okay, now I'm going to be creative and I'm going to generate lots of ideas, and it's good even if a lot of them are bad, because then I'm going kind of outside of my typical thinking. And then at a different stage, and even in a different location, so you've got separate places for this, then you can go back and look at the quality. And they do that kind of thing at Disney. They'd have this, rooms where they'd generate ideas, and then they have another room for storyboarding that they'd look at the practicality of it, and then another room where that was called the hot room or the sweat room, where they'd view an example of it and be really, Walt Disney would be really critical, but they'd separate those so that they weren't doing them all at the same time.
Yeah, that is really cool. I never knew that about Disney, but it does sound like a great idea. If you're trying to come up with a name for, say you're writing a book and you're trying to come up with a name for a character, and then if you came up with 25 names, and then you could move on, at least you could do something else and then come back to those 25 names later on and say, no, these names are no good. These are the better names. It sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, and you can find lots of examples of that around. There's an author named Stephen James who writes sort of criminal novels, but he wrote a really fantastic book called Story Trump Structure. And one of the things he talks about is that very often, when he's reading a book, you can tell where someone's going to go with the plot because they just kind of took the first idea that occurred to them. And so what he suggests is, okay, for a lot of these key points in the plot, you generate, okay, what's my first idea? What's my second idea? What's my 10th and 15th? And often it's the 20th idea that is really, will take it in a direction that they can't see coming, but that also fits really well. I've heard the same kind of thing for people who write copy for advertising. Your first idea for a headline is going to be so-so, but often it's the 20th idea or the 30th idea that's the best.
Mm-hmm. So is that the biggest mistake that people commit with storytelling?
I think that's one of the biggest, because you can't really get anything going if you're stuck. And then once they get going, I think you have to really understand the key elements of structure and stories. Something I've seen in classes a lot is that a lot of people don't really know how to define a story. They don't know what a story is. They'll think they're telling a story when they're not. Especially if they've worked in like a corporate environment at all, they'll talk in a very vague, generalized way that, and at the end, you don't know really what they said. But if you understand key elements, like at the start of a story, we have to be able to empathize with the protagonist, or at least know a little bit about them. And then we have to understand like the routine, and then there's the break in the routine. Some sort of problem comes up, and then you have to have an escalation of complications. You have to have things get worse and worse and worse and more complicated, and more, the stakes have to raise. And then you have to have some sort of resolution that comes from the main character that we care about, and we get to see some change from beginning to end. And there are different structures depending on the context of what you're doing. You can go, okay, so what is the next key part in the story? Like, am I creating that? Because there are plenty of times. It's interesting with fiction, even with fictional things, people will often worry almost about their audience. And so like they introduce a problem, but then they immediately solve it, or there's never a problem to begin with, or they talk in a generalized fashion. So there's not like one specific instance that they're going like this happens and this happens and this happens. So you really have to understand the structure of a story in order to tell a good story.
So is that part of your teaching process with people?
Yeah. So the way, what I focus on with students is, I kind of go through it step by step by step. So like in the first couple classes, we work on just generating ideas and building on ideas and accepting ideas, kind of the typical like improv idea of yes and. So you accept whatever ideas come up, and then you build on them and find out where they go. And then after that, I start going into structures, like, okay, so what is the structure of good storytelling? Like how, what is that? So the process I described of the sort of once upon a time, there was this character, and every day they had this certain routine, until one day there was this break in the routine and things get worse and worse and worse, until finally there's a resolution. That's what I call the story arc. And that can be very, very helpful in, it's very simple, but it really helps you understand how to move things along. There are also other things like, you've got dialogue, and so you've got characters talking to each other, or you've got description of the setting, and you've got action, and you have to have those. You have to have a nice mix of those. If you have too much description or too much dialogue, it can get hunkered down and boring. If you've got too much action, then you don't really, it's like one of those car chase movies where you never really know who any of the people are, and they. And then, I go into different aspects. I talk to them about how to improvise a speech. And again, there's a structure of it. You need to have a compelling opening that intrigues people. You need to have a structure that, for example, like talking about the problems that people are facing and presenting your solution, and then talking about the benefits of that. And then, a recap and a request. Like that kind of structure is very fitting for, nonfiction books, right? So like in a nonfiction book, you need to detail what the problem is, so your audience recognizes themselves and wants to fix it, and then you talk about the steps of solving the problem, and then you talk about the benefits that'll present to the person, and you give them a clear action plan. When you're writing a book in a nonfiction, that's typically what I would do. Is I'd write the chapters, the titles of the chapter that I would want to do, and then I'd figure out kind of the structure, and then I'd fill in the material that goes in the structure, and it's pretty easy to do it that way.
So you had like an outline.
Yeah, an outline. But it's, and very flexible though. You go, say you're talking about golfing. Well, your problem is that your putts they go into the water. I don't know. And I don't play golf. And then, the solution is this new backhanded whatever deal. And then, the benefit of that is that even when it's windy on the runway, then on the runway. I don't know anything about golf, but it's you find these kind of structures that help guide you, so you don't feel like you're flying blind, and then you can look back and see, did I accomplish my goals? Are there ways I could do it better?
Well, Chad, let's go back a little bit. You were talking about public speaking. And a number of the authors that we've interviewed talk about going to bookstores or to schools or to events and doing public speaking. Do you have any specific advice for somebody who's an author who's not necessarily outgoing to give just a short introduction? Sometimes at a bookstore or a signing, the author will stand up and just speak for just a couple of minutes and then take questions and then sign books or whatever. Do you have any advice for somebody who has something like that planned?
There are lots of different things that could be useful for that kind of person. I think if you're nervous with that kind of thing, one of the things to think about is almost thinking of it more as like a conversation rather than, if you think of it like you're trying to pitch or like you have to,
sure.
Again, if you're putting pressure on yourself to get a certain result, like it just increases the stress so much. It's also a really good idea to get yourself in the right mood. So one of the things that's, you can just play some simple like improv style games, or just do something creative, invent a story and have some sort of fun with that so that you're in a creative space where you're mentally agile in advance. Something fun. Maybe you enjoy dancing or whatnot. But then when you're there, you want to look at, this is something you actually really love, and the people who are there because they're interested in it too. So it's definitely not an adversarial relationship, right? And so you get to pick the most interesting, exciting parts about this thing you love and talk about it with people who also are fascinated by that. And just that perspective and that way of approaching it can make a big difference.
Right. That seems like that can definitely cut back, because you think, oh my gosh, all these people are going to be so critical of me, when actually they just want to they want you to succeed. They want to hear your story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they totally do. Like it would be an insane person who would go there and not want you to succeed.
Right.
And, there was this publicist, this famous Hollywood publicist who was kind of the top publicist in Hollywood for 20 years, but he had a really bad stutter. And he describes in his book about how he was starting to go into handling these big companies for television accounts and stuff. And a meeting that he was doing this presentation that should have taken half an hour took an hour because he was stuttering so bad and he was sweating and all of this. But the group he was presenting to at the end, they didn't care because, he still got the job because they wanted someone who could do a good job, not someone who it didn't matter how he talked. But they did afterwards, they went out for a drink and they kind of laughed about it. And he realized that he should just mention the stutter up front in kind of a humorous way himself. And that would often get rid of the stress of it. And, you can at the start, if you want to, just really quickly say hey, I'm nervous, or make some sort of joke about it. One thing I would say don't do is don't criticize yourself. Don't say look, I'm really bad at this. I'm going to do a horrible job. People don't want to watch you beat yourself up, but an honest hey, I'm nervous, but I'm really looking forward to this. People want to support you in that case.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent advice.
So let's go back to your book. When you had a pamphlet style and then you decided, I'm going to increase this into a book, did you find it difficult?
That's a good question. Not really. I mean, well, here's one of the nice things about being a teacher of the thing that you're writing a book about is that you have lots and lots of experience with what people need to know with that thing and what they ask. And that's actually been a big help in the second book that I've been working on, because with the second book, so I kind of wrote a draft of it. And then in my classes that I have now, I started during the classes, before each class in the 8-week series, I'd send one chapter to the students so they could read it. And that was
wonderful.
Yeah, because then they've got familiar with what we're going to cover, so we can cover a lot more in the class. But B, I can find out what did they read but they didn't understand, or what didn't they get, or they'll also, through certain comments that they, that are kind of subtle, I can pick up what captured their interest, what didn't. And so it's over the course of time, it's been this process of I notice what they understood from it. I notice what they got and what, held their attention. I go back and I revise the chapter based on what I'm seeing in the class. And that has been tremendously valuable. And I also I have like beta readers now. Like when someone has really enjoyed the book and they want to read more, I'll say, okay, like, how about you give me feedback on the chapters? And then that's been another way. But the process of teaching and incorporating that into the writing process of the book is like incredibly helpful. Writing in a vacuum is very hard, but writing with getting feedback is so much easier.
Right.
And it sounds like in real time, excuse me.
I was going to say that. Yeah, getting it right away from the students. You go and you teach the class and you see what sticks.
Yeah. And something that's interesting too is even the process of sending it to them will make you notice things about the chapter that you didn't notice. There have been chapters where I was like, okay, I feel this is pretty good. And then I send the chapter to my students in the class series that I'm doing. And right after I send it, I go, you know what? There's that thing on page 5 that needs fixed. And I don't know what it is. Like you just start seeing it from their perspective and you go, damn it.
Yeah. The Author Inside You podcast is brought to you by
Scribblefile. You can find it at scribophle.com. It's a fantastic writing community where writers of all genres come together to support and critique each other's work.
There are writer groups where you'll find like-minded writers, or you can even start your own writing group. Or there are forums where you can meet other members to discuss all things writings, ask for and give help, or talk about life in general.
Another great aspect of Scribblefile is that you can send private messages within the web page. So say you join a writers group and you become friends with some of the writers within the group, you can actually send private messages back and forth and not have to do it via email. So other members can learn more about you, what your style is like, and gain some fans.
With all the wonderful resources on Scribblefile.com, now is the time to make your book a reality. There is no reason not to start writing your book.
So if you're looking for a beta reader or some like-minded writers, check out Scribblefile.com.
Did you have an editor?
Sort of. So for the first one, no. The one that's actually like on Amazon, no. And you can see that, and like it's one of those things where you just have to be comfortable making mistakes. Like it's kind of interesting. There are like some typos and some formatting issues that are I'm comfortable with. Like I'm like, okay, I'm focusing on the next book. This other one can stand on its own legs. But with this other one that I want to do a really good job of, first off, I've got this sort of ongoing editing process, but then I also make sure there's a program called Pro Writing Aid, put it through that, and then like I'll read the book aloud, make marks on like what part doesn't flow, what doesn't sound right, what is weird. Then, so my ex-girlfriend, she's been nice enough at times to read the chapters and will either like make notes on it, or I've had her read it aloud to me so that I can hear what she has problems with, or when she that's another real-time feedback. They'll like laugh and be like, the person will laugh and go like, that sounds weird, like, or like that doesn't make any sense. And that is another thing that's been super useful. And like she has she was an English major, so that was helpful. But that kind of process is actually really useful. Just getting anyone to read it and read it aloud to you. There's a copywriter, a guy named Gary Halbert, who's died about a decade ago. But in his work on where he talked about copywriting, one of the things he said he'd do is, because he wrote like advertisement type stuff, like sales letters, but he'd go to a local bar and ask them to a bunch of people there. He's like, I'm going to buy you a round of drinks if you'll just listen to this advertisement I wrote. And so he would read it aloud to them, and he'd notice their responses. And in particular, one of the interesting things with this is that he would go, okay, like, did they say like, hey, yeah, that was good, that was cool? In which case he knew he had to rewrite it, because what he was looking for is them to say, oh, wow, that's really great. Like, how can I buy that thing or like, how can I buy that service that was talked about in there? Because then he knew he did a good job. And I've actually found that same sort of thing. Like if someone, people aren't always good at giving criticism, but if they read one of the chapters and they say, oh, that was really good, I'm like, okay, that wasn't good enough. But if they say, oh, I I saw how I could use that in the future, or, oh, I'd love to read another chapter because like I can see how I can apply this. Then I go, okay, that's good. Or like if they have specific things like this is something I want to use. And so really looking at, okay, getting that more immediate feedback and then what is the actual feedback you're getting was really very educational.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, Chad, you mentioned Pro Writing Aid. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you've, it's similar to like Grammarly, which I think is more famous, but it's basically a software program where you can, it'll take your writing and it'll go through and go like, okay, what are first of all, what are spelling issues, typos, that kind of thing, but also how can you write this more clearly? How can you turn it from like the passive voice into the active voice? It'll suggest actions, it'll suggest synonyms, it'll suggest changing the sentence structure, all that kind of thing in order to make your writing better. And that actually, through those suggestions, you can also help to internalize the process of editing. So anyone who's read like the Elements of Style by Strunk and White know any number of these little tips that you can do in order to write more clearly and to write more effectively, but it takes practice, and that helps point them out so you can keep going, okay, like I wrote in the passive voice there, okay, like I use a vague word, or okay, or my sentences are geared towards like they're like in the 12th grade level. So people and if you really want people to be able to read your work for a wide audience, you want to get down into, at least down in the 7th grade, maybe down in the 5th grade. So it offers really good advice. And the more times you go through your own work, like certain things will become invisible for you. And so having an outside feedback like that, or any of the other outside feedbacks I mentioned, like it is really helpful because it gives you that new eye, that fresh eye.
Yeah, it seems like a very important tool.
It sounds like a built-in coach kind of.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's exactly it. It's a built-in coach. And I just, while I'm giving recommendations, another, because I mentioned Stephen James's book earlier, another really good book for anyone who wants to be better at storytelling is by Matthew Dix, and it's called Storyworthy. And Matthew Dix is if you've ever listened to the Moth podcast, which is a storytelling podcast, he's won like 50 of their Grand Slams, something like that.
He is great.
Yeah, and so that's a really good book that's well worth reading.
Right. So my friend Dave Jackson, who has a podcast or lots of podcasts, talks about Matthew Dix all the time. And I understand, Chad, you have a podcast too. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's called Intriguing Interviews, and I actually interviewed Matthew on there. He was my first interview, but I hitchhiked when I was 17. It was not like running away or anything. I actually told my family that I was going to hitchhike, but
wait, this is a whole nother story.
They gave me a backpack for my trip,
wow.
And so I went hitchhiking across the country, and so I was doing it for about 5 days, but I did couch surfing, which is this website where you can stay in with strangers' homes like all over the world. And
our nephew did that. I remember we're like, what are you doing? That doesn't sound safe.
There's serial killers out there.
It's like, no, it's safe. It's safer. I'm meeting great people.
Yeah, it's they do a pretty good job of making sure it's safe, and they are really, like, you just meet wonderful people doing that kind of thing. And so I kind of view the podcast as like audio hitchhiking. So I get the chance to, meet really fascinating people and ask them about their lives that I never would have met. I met, Matthew, who's like a best-selling author and who has really interesting stories, an FBI agent who has fascinating stories from the FBI. I love hearing stories. This woman who works with sloths in Costa Rica and other animals, and like she raises them, and she's only able to like sleep for 4 hours at a chunk because she has to feed these baby sloths.
Oh my
There's like a man in the Netherlands who's a therapist who's kind of like a negative therapist. Like, he'll tell the person all the negative things they believe about themselves so that they will fight back and be like, no, I'm not that bad. And you get to gain a glimpse into all of these fascinating worlds. It's called Intriguing Interviews, and if you go to Apple Podcasts, then you can just search for Intriguing Interviews, and if you need to, add in the name Chad Elliot, and you can find it there.
Excellent. We'll put a link in the show notes of this episode so everybody
Thanks.
can find it and subscribe. That'd be great.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Well, Chad, you've given us tons of great, useful information today, but is there any one last ending thing that you can give our listener for somebody who hasn't finished writing their book yet?
I think the most important thing to understand with that is that the not finishing it is an internal issue. It's an internal block. It's like a comfort zone issue. It's not going to be about some special time in the future when things will be different. It's about changing something inside yourself as far as how you're approaching it, how you're viewing it. One of the things that helped me was that I was viewing it as a learning process, and I wanted to go out and just do it. And I didn't mind making mistakes because I wanted to, in the long term, I wanted to see, okay, how can I do this better 2 years from now? I wasn't doing it to be successful in the moment. I was doing it to be successful a couple years in the future when I had more experience. But the only way I could gain that experience is by doing it. One sort of mental trick you can do is actually, rather than trying to do a good job, is to try and do kind of a mediocre job or a bad job, because it's okay, I'm just going to kind of do this badly. And often you actually won't do it badly. You'll do pretty well, but it gets rid of that mental block. And, another way to kind of get past that is to go at it from another direction. So I had a student in the classes who had been working on a book. She'd worked on it for a long time, but then she had writer's block for a year. And then she came to the classes, and after the first class, she started writing her book again. But it was just because she had gotten in front of an audience and done something out of her comfort zone, played some creative games. It was kind of a random, I don't even think she directly was thinking of the book at the time she did the class. She was more just looking for a way to shake things up otherwise, and it came about when she wasn't expecting it.
Well, Chad, if our listeners are interested in finding more about your improv classes, where should they go?
I have a website called Seattle Improv Classes. At the moment, of course, all classes in the world are shut down. However, I do, and I'm sure they'll reopen again, but I do a lot of coaching with students over the phone, and I actually have basically a version of my classes that I do one-on-one with students over the phone. And so if they go to seattleimprovclasses.com/coaching, there's all sorts of information about that, and it works really, really well. A lot of people, I think, are surprised that you can do that kind of thing over the phone. But I mean, you can talk over the phone, you can do stories over the phone, you can act out a scene, you can improvise a speech, you can do anything over the phone. So it's really fun and I enjoy it.
Well, Chad, you've been a great guest. Thank you very much for joining us today on The Author Inside You.
Thank you very much. This is a lot of fun talking with you both.
We always enjoy hearing what people think about our podcast.
So if you have a second, drop us a line at theauthorinsideyou@gmail.com.
Until next time,
right on.
Thank you for listening to the Author Inside You podcast with your host, Leah and Matt Rafferty.